Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It's Friday, August 3rd, 2018. Yay! Thank God it's Friday, I guess. I don't know. It's all the same at this point. Let's see. So many things in the news today. At least everything is working normally. All the buttons being pressed on time. I think I've discovered a new pre-show routine. In order to be a successful broadcaster, and I'm not a successful broadcaster. I'm not broadcasting at all, for one thing. You got to have one of those idiosyncratic pre-show routines, and I have never had one. And that's been the big problem. So I'm going to strike it rich now. I'm going to be Rush Limbaugh by tomorrow. I don't know. Stupid thing. I have this nice iced coffee at home, and I've been, drink a little bit maybe before the show. The problem is, I guess it's I don't know whether it uses corn syrup as the sweetener. Is that what does it when you get that sort of tacky taste or feel in your mouth after you drink it? And it's not good to get on the microphone after that. You're like, mwah, 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 and it makes all sorts of horrible noises. You know, the disgusting noise I just made in your ear. That one. Right. So, I usually have a big cup of water nearby, too. That doesn't really do the trick. I have run out of my normal vitamin C tablets, of which I eat 17,000 before getting on the air. And all that's around are my kids' gummy vitamin C's. Okay. I figure, what the heck? They taste like candy at worst. I guess what is it? Ascorbic acid, maybe? That is vitamin C. And the citric acid in there for flavoring. It's an orange flavored thing. Between that and I don't know what else goes in a gummy, that clears it right up. That's amazing, which is odd because I would have guessed, I don't know, I have never looked at the ingredients, but I would have guessed that the main ingredient in gummy anything is corn syrup. But what do I know? The gummy farmers of America are going to be, all over me for making that mistake. Anyway, just thought I'd share that little detail with you because it's super important. Nothing else is going on today, and there's no news. All is normal, and Donald Trump is like a great president and stuff, and we have no problems, so I don't know what we're going to do the show about today. There are plenty of directions we could go in, of course. If you are waking up on this Friday morning, if you're waking up on another Friday morning, I don't know what to tell you. I can't help you. But if you're waking up on this Friday morning, down in New Orleans for Netroots Nation 2018, and you arrived, and the actual programming, I don't even know. Did they start the programming earlier? I know there was a trend. There's been a trend towards moving it earlier and earlier, and I don't know whether in the past 200 years since I've gone, whether they've moved official programming to Wednesday or not, but I think they've stuck to the mostly Thursday schedule. Yesterday would have been the first day of official business there, and the first day that most people arrived on site, and so last night would have been the first round of parties. And so it is early in the morning in New Orleans, and you're on day 2 of Netroots Nation. So bring the headphones in tight, and I'll shout loudly into the microphone and help you with your hangover this morning. It's a big booze fest, the whole thing. Also, some work gets done there, and you learn a lot too. But you erase it all at night, and so it's a wash. In the end, though, it's always nice to come down wherever they visit and drop a couple of bucks and learn a few things about maybe going back home and turning things around and painting the town blue, as it were, and taking back control of the country, whatever's left of it. Let's review what's left of it and see what sorts of items we can weave together. There's about 14 different shows that we could do today, all of which wouldn't fit in the 2 hours anyway, so I should stop with all this nonsense and get on to the good stuff. But just to sort of get my feet underneath me, I want to talk about some of the things that have occupied my attention and yours, likely, on Twitter and elsewhere. Happenings down in Lynchburg, Virginia. This is something to keep an eye on. There'll be some astonishing video, no doubt. I guess Virginia in general, a lot of the East Coast has been I assume that records are being broken all over the East Coast. I know it's the case for our area in Virginia. Record rainfall during July. Now, I was away for some of July, but I assure you it rained plenty in Iceland. But apparently we're like, I think the old July rainfall record, if I saw it correctly as it flashed by on the TV screen when the meteorologist was going over this stuff, 2-point-something inches of rain in May. It's normally a pretty dry month, and we usually find ourselves at the end of the summer worrying about drought conditions. But I think we've had instead 9+ inches of rain in the area, and we're starting to have trees fall over because the ground is saturated. Well, down in Lynchburg, they're going to have dams fall over. The Lynchburg's College Lake Dam, apparently at risk of failing as of last night, and they apparently thought the failure of the dam was imminent. And I mean, by which I mean, I guess, that the whole thing collapses. I mean, as dams go, it was something of a failure last night anyway, because the water was just pouring over the top of it and began flooding the town, and they just thought the whole thing was going to go over. And that would be a great and fitting end to Infrastructure Week, don't you think? We're doing great on the infrastructure point. Of course, in response to this imminent danger, and word was that the failure of the dam would have drowned at least the downstream part of Lynchburg, Virginia, in something like, what did they say, 17 feet of water in 7 minutes? Or do I have that backwards? Was it 7 feet of water? I think that was it. I think that was really what they were talking about. And that seems like an awful lot of water. And in response, of course, yeah, that's right, 17 feet of water in 7 minutes. Michael Musson has actually sent me that information as well, so I can double check things. But, of course, I'm sure he's monitoring the situation, is Donald Trump, from his golf course in Bedminster, New Jersey, where he arrived yesterday evening, after a grueling third campaign-style rally for the week. He's done absolutely squat he's done squat while he's been president. So this was another week of that, and then took off for the golf course because what else am I going to do? Be president? That's not happening. Meanwhile, don't know where the girls are. Still don't. That is not news to you, but of course it happens to go along with the discovery now. I mean, one after another. There's going to be more and more of this, of course. The discovery of the charges pending against one worker at one of the facilities that held the migrant children in detention, and of course that he is now accused of abusing several of them sexually. No surprise to anybody who had guessed a long time ago that a lot of this detention was maybe chiefly about putting tender age and other vulnerable children in the line of fire for sexual abuse. They also think they have a political agenda behind it, but I don't think they really give a crap about that, to be honest. I think they really just wanted to get some kids isolated and thought that would be a great way of doing it. And no one ever suspects that the immigration forces would be interested in doing that rather than enforcing immigration, as you might otherwise guess first. All right, well, plenty more happening, but those two things I think rate a mention. And we can now move on to some of the other issues of the day. I will note for the record that though Trump did in fact hold his third rally last evening, and who the F cares where it is? I think it was in Pennsylvania. The major networks, Fox, I think, covered it dutifully, but I do believe that it's actually beginning to sink in. We'll have to see whether they can do it twice in a row. But I guess they made some decision somewhere along the line that maybe they ought not to cover every single thing he does live and uninterrupted. They decided not to air live video from the rally. Of course, they attended it, sent reporters, videotaped it, And I think that's at least a start. I mean, I don't know if it really is helpful or would be helpful if they just didn't go at all and didn't even provide any footage or coverage of it. I don't know whether that would mean. Well, I think he would certainly respond to that by saying, I need to get them back, so I will be as controversial as possible and say something awful. And it's valuable to document when the president does stuff like that. That's true. So hopefully they will end up striking the right balance, and and it has some effect. I don't know what else to say about it. All right. Many other stories, some of which I have discussed in Twitter, some of which I have not, others of which I've put aside in Pocket. And Kitty, what's going on here? Oh, yes. A comment here. Gideon chiming in via email. We still trying to find the right way to have Gideon get his comments in. I don't know. Twitter seems to be a problem for him, and it's probably a privacy thing. Eventually, we're all going to be hacked, and I think Gideon knows that before we do. But yeah, Trump is playing golf. He's a lazy man, and it's of course just another one of the crazy contradictions. He spent so much of his time prior to becoming president criticizing exactly that in Barack Obama, and it must have been his economic anxiety. I assume that's the big problem for him. All right, Pocket is chock full of things that need to be shared and different directions to go in with it. I don't even know exactly where to start. Let's try racing around frantically and trying to catch people up on things. There's a new take on the Maria Butina story and additional of course there was going to be auto-playing video. Let me adjust for that and make sure that I can keep things under control. I also wanted to open up another story, which I know must be... there we go. It's right next to it. So we got lots of Russia stuff to cover, but there's Middle Eastern stuff to cover. There's the domestic implications, obviously, of all this stuff. Let's get around to it. Sarah Murray at CNN had this story, which got a lot of attention yesterday. Alleged Russian agents, that's Maria Butina, alleged Russian agents' infiltration of GOP circles is anything but subtle. And I would have to agree. It is illustrated, in fact, with a photo of Maria Butina wearing a giant, embroidered and maybe even rhinestoned, I haven't taken a close look, cowboy hat, and holding one of those giant, exaggeratedly, is that a word? Long-barreled, chromed revolvers, like a big, like a stupid-looking Yosemite Sam style gun, in a cowboy hat. I am undercover as U.S. American Yankee. No one will, she wasn't undercover, but yeah, anything but subtle. That's a good way to put it. Maybe a flaming redhead is, it's not designed to be subtle. But the point is that it was also politically less than subtle. As far as spycraft goes, Maria Butina's skills didn't seem particularly impressive. They really usually don't. The alleged covert Russian agent liked to communicate via Twitter messages and WhatsApp. Her overly flirtatious approach, that was the job, left men wondering what she was truly after. Well, no difference there, I guess, than anybody else. What does anybody know about what anyone is truly after? Men, women, or otherwise. She tended to brag about her ties to Russian intelligence when she was intoxicated, according to people familiar with the situation. That is a crappy spy. But, and I assure you, that'll be offered as evidence in people's trials, not just hers, but in others. So I didn't think she was a spy. Why would I think she was a spy? She was going around getting drunk all the time and talking about her ties to Russian intelligence. It's an interesting twist on things. Great spin, right? Why would that make me think she's a spy? And then, the prosecutor, of course, stands here and says, are you kidding? I don't understand what is your question? You're wondering, she's constantly blabbing about her ties to Russian intelligence, and you want to know why that would make you think she's a spy? Because she's saying, I am a spy. And they would just say, oh, well, would a spy really be blabbing drunk about their ties to Russian intelligence? Wouldn't they keep that a secret? You have me there. I don't know. I bet, well, you know, God help us if it's a whole jury of QAnon theorists. So, you know, what could go wrong? Okay, so she would get drunk and brag about her ties to Russian intelligence. She's like a Scud missile. There's no precision. That's some parallel. Said CIA veteran Robert Baer, a CNN intelligence and security analyst. It's like hearkening back to the old days. Remember when we covered those Scud missiles in Iraq? Oh, that was awesome. Butina has pleaded not guilty to charges of conspiracy and acting as a foreign agent in the U.S. Her lawyer, Robert Driscoll, told CNN Wednesday that she wouldn't take a deal from prosecutors if it meant admitting she was a spy. See, she's a great spy. If you're not an agent for a foreign government, you can't lie and say you are in order to get rid of this, Driscoll said. Well, you can. I mean, it's just that we vary on our definition of getting rid of this. But intelligence experts say Butina's far from subtle approach to infiltrating Republican political circles in the U.S. appears to be just one tactic, in Moscow's arsenal as Russian President Vladimir Putin aimed to influence American politics and disrupt democracy ahead of the 2016 election. Those efforts are continuing, Trump administration officials say, in the run-up to the midterm elections. But, of course, you know, we didn't note on the program, but Republicans in Congress, of course, rejecting any legislation aimed at finding funding for combating that interference. Gee whiz, I wonder why. Putin has numerous intelligence services at his disposal. Some excel in hacking, others churn out seasoned operatives to gather intelligence and quietly recruit Americans, but there are also more informal missions, ones that are often directed by Putin himself, with the help of Russia's Federal Security Service, or FSB, the KGB's successor. It's much less structured. Alina Polyakova, a Russia expert, because she's Russian, and foreign policy fellow at the Brookings Institution, said of Russia's influence operations, there's often a kind of proxy lead actor who is usually an oligarch close to the regime that is given a project as he outsources portions of that project. And by the way, I'll call time out on the oligarch mention to harken back to yesterday's discussion of how the judge in the Paul Manafort case instructed the prosecutors, at least, not to use the word oligarch in arguing the case in his courtroom. And I was a little bit puzzled as to why that would be. And I'm still puzzled as to why that would be. But it may not be a bad thing. It may open up an opportunity to describe them differently. And our good Twitter friend, who we know on Twitter as Chief Beef Loco, has been emailing furiously, as a matter of fact, but makes, among a flood of points made daily, one that I think I ought to pass on, which was that, you know, this is actually an opportunity to get away from syntax or terminology that actually doesn't do us very much good. That is to say, that describing them as oligarchs is probably doing them a tremendous favor, and almost setting them up as, you know, even though we wouldn't recognize in America oligarchy as a legitimate form of government. It's worth pointing out that what makes one an oligarch in Russia is being essentially a mob boss, that they ought to be described, and his point was that if they weren't white, well, other white people would be calling them gangs and cartels and organized crime and mobsters. But because they are, you know, white and wear suits, oligarchs, or that they're foreign, oligarchs is, for some reason, the term of choice. And I thought, hey, that's actually a pretty good point. Why don't I share that with everybody? So really, maybe for our own experiment, every time we see oligarchs, we ought to just substitute in mobsters or crime bosses. I mean, you know, why not? All sorts of, I mean, this would be going rather far afield, but it's something we've talked about a little bit in the past. I mean, there's a lot of ethnocentrism going on in this, and it's not even our ethnicities that we're now being ethnocentric about, except for the fact that they're white. I guess, but there's lots of white people to whom we're not particularly closely related. Anyway, look, the political situation is chaotic at best in places like, say, Somalia, right? But they still have a loose political organization. It's not the kind we would prefer that people have. It's not one that would fit very well here in the United States, though we're experimenting with it. But if it goes beyond our capacity to understand, even as oligarchs, or I guess because they don't have a tremendous amount of money, we shy away from calling them that. But they're clearly gang leaders, but we have gangs here in the United States. So to set it even further apart, we call people who vie for localized political and military, and maybe that's part of the reason, control of areas of Somalia, just to make sure that everybody knows that they're horrible, horrible, disgusting others. They're warlords. I mean, what's Eric Prince? The guy lives on a armed, secluded, walled-in compound in the middle of, the middle of, where does he live? In the UAE. Doesn't even live in the United States. And by the way, his sister's yacht flagged in the Cayman Islands. There's no loyalty to the United States whatsoever in the entire family, apparently. But I know I've wandered far afield. But yeah, I mean, the terminology we hang on people, it drives an awful lot of how we see them. And it stands to reason. I think all of you know exactly why it works that way. But we ought not to help them out in that. So where were we with this? Yes. There's often a kind of proxy lead actor who is usually a mob crime boss close to the, at least they say, regime, which is something considered in English less than a legitimate government. But okay, so a crime boss close to the regime that's given a project as he outsources that portion of the project. All right, I almost think of it as project management, Polyakova added. Remember Polyakova? She was the Brookings Institution Russia expert. It also helps shed light on why run-ins between a ragtag assortment of Russians, mobsters, right, also, and members of Donald Trump's orbit appeared so random. In April 2016, a Maltese professor with Kremlin ties informed Trump campaign advisor George Papadopoulos that the Russians had thousands of damaging emails about Hillary Clinton, according to court records. A month later, a Russian man who went by Henry Greenberg made a more overt offer to longtime Trump advisor Roger Stone, damaging information on Clinton in exchange for $2 million. Henry Greenberg? Was that the guy who we were reading was like being described as legendary businessman, and we never heard of him? Is that the same guy? I'm terrible with the names like that, but hold on a second. Hang on. I'm going to actually Google along with the reading, Greenberg. I mean, I don't... No, maybe not. Well, there's the story about Trump, or rather Roger Stone and Henry Greenberg. But maybe I have that wrong. But I'm not... I'm not... I must. I don't know. It doesn't look like it rings a bell in my quick search. But okay, anyway, he demanded $2 million in exchange for damaging information on Clinton. Stone said he believes the offer was part of a law enforcement setup directed at the Trump campaign. That same month, May of 2016, Butina and her alleged handler, Kremlin-linked banker Alexander Torshin, / mob boss, snagged a brief meet and greet with Donald Trump Jr. on the sidelines of the National Rifle Association's annual meeting in Louisville, Kentucky. That was only after her efforts with Torshin to establish back-channel communications between candidate Trump and Putin fell short. By June of 2016, a Russian lawyer met with Trump Jr. and other top campaign officials in the now infamous Trump Tower meeting. The Trump officials believed the lawyer was there to offer dirt on Clinton. The offer was pushed by a Russian billionaire, i.e. mob boss, with ties to Putin. You all know about that, of course. By the way, brief detour on that front. Did I put this tweet aside? I think I grabbed from the other day, and now things are just piling up and piling up and piling up. Did I not grab it? I know I hope I at least retweeted it, but there was a note on one of Trump's most recent, complaints and squawkings on Twitter about the accusations against him. I might have to scroll back and see if I can find things this way. But was it our pal on Twitter, the View from LL2, right? Susan, is it Simpson? Her last name, I'm going to have to scroll back a couple of days to find the actual tweet so I can share it with you later. But her comment was on one of Trump's complaints where he blurted out the other day, the truth is that there's plenty of evidence that the Clinton campaign paid to try and find dirt on me. And I think here he's supposedly referring to the fact that the DNC and the campaign decided to pick up the tab for Fusion GPS to continue their work on the Steele dossier once, of course, that having been initiated by Republicans. Once they finally started to find things, they said, well, if the Republicans are no longer interested because they've made him the nominee, then we'd be interested because we don't particularly care to see him win. And he viewed that as the rough equivalent of his having accepted aid from the Russians in all this. Well, you tried to find out information from Russians too. Yeah, you sent a Western allied spy to Russia to talk to Russians to say, do you know something about Donald Trump colluding with Russians or being involved with Russian mob bosses? That's not exactly the same thing as working with the government, of course. But Susan had quite the analysis of that one. I'll tease you with that and be back in 2 minutes and see if I can find it. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, interrupting this little break to say thanks so much to all of you who are contributing supporters of Kagro in the Morning. Thousands of you are downloading the show each day, but fewer than 1 in 25 regular listeners are donating to help keep us on the air. For the money you'd spend on a single 3-minute iTunes song, we bring you 2 hours of great news and entertainment every day, 5 days a week. Patreon.com, Patreon.com makes it easy. You can find us there by searching KagroX or David Waldman or Kagro in the Morning or even Daily Coast Radio in their search box, and you'll be right where you need to be to make easy, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Once again, thanks so much for your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Welcome back to those of you who may have wandered away from their computer/radio for the last 2 minutes. Hey, get back here. We got things to talk about. I should really move on even from the Butina thing. I'm already falling behind schedule, but I knew I would. Susan Simpson's tweet, I found it. The View from LL2. She was reacting to Donald Trump's tweeted, then deleted, then retweeted without the spelling error tweet, which you may recall read thus: we already have a smoking gun about a campaign getting dirt on their opponent. It was Hillary Clinton. And you may recall that the spelling error was he wanted everybody to know that they already had a smoking gun about the campaign of Hillary Clinton getting dirt on its opponent. But we already have a smoking gun about a campaign getting dirt on their opponent. It was Hillary Clinton. How is it okay, he asked, for Hillary Clinton to proactively seek dirt from the Russians, that is, Russians on the street? What do you know about Donald Trump as opposed to from the government or the mobsters who run Russia? Very different. But okay, how is it okay for Hillary Clinton to proactively seek dirt from the Russians, but the Trump campaign met at the Russians' request, and that is bad? And he's got it enclosed in quotes here, and then has the name of Mark Thiessen, Washington Post, after it. Is he quoting him? Did he say that? I'm not even really sure about that, because I didn't see any. I mean, maybe I missed the article in which that's asked. But at any rate, Susan Simpson asks about that. Am I forgetting a tweet, or is this the first time Trump has acknowledged that the Trump campaign did indeed meet with the Russians to get dirt on his opponent? I think he inadvertently admitted to that right there, even if he was quoting somebody else. If he quotes that person approvingly, and he does, how stupid is that? I know he's trying to make the point, oh yeah, it's whataboutism. Why is it bad that I met with Russians, that is to say, the Russian government, who had broken into computers and been conducting hacking in order to come up with the dirt, which wasn't even dirt. How is that different from going to Russia and asking people, what do you know about Donald Trump and his business interests here in this country? That's the same thing, because both worked with Russians. Now, one stole information and one simply went around asking people questions. One worked with the Russian government, another one spoke to people on the street in Russia. But hey, no different. But that's all beside the point. The whataboutism that he rushes to actually gives himself up, right? That's pretty amazing. It's an astute observation. How is it okay for Hillary Clinton to proactively seek dirt, but it's not okay for me to proactively seek dirt? Wait a minute. You've denied that you proactively sought dirt. And I still do. But how is it okay for her to do it and me to be accused of it, is what I meant. I meant won't. I meant will. I mean, I wouldn't. I don't know. It's a good point. Good catch, Susan. All right. Let's get back to Maria Butina. Okay, look. She was not subtle. We understand that. Let's get some specific examples and then exit this thing. Athena 5000, by the way, pointing out, quite true. She was undercover. She was under a lot of covers with several people. And that seems to have been her most valuable MO. So the section here that says, a not-so-secret agent with distinctive red hair, a fiery personality, and an affinity for social media, Butina operated at a higher decibel level, I think is what they mean, than one might expect from an alleged covert agent. In her graduate level classes at American University, yeah, we haven't talked much about that. I put aside a couple of stories about her being at American University and her activities there, and publishing op-eds about computer security, of all things. In her graduate level classes at American University, a cover for work on behalf of the Russian government, according to prosecutors. And what could be better cover? American University. How Russian can I be? Butina vociferously defended Putin. She also claimed in class to be a liaison between the Trump campaign and the Russians, according to a person familiar with the situation. People who met her through school and through political events described her as a little too friendly. She was quick to start playing footsie under the table, or sidle up to an older man at a political event and suddenly request that they become friends on Facebook, according to people who knew her. Suggestive, but not outrageous. On at least 2 separate occasions, she got drunk and spoke openly about her contacts with the Russian government, even acknowledging that Russian intelligence services were involved with the gun rights group she ran in Moscow. That seems kind of dumb. Twice, classmates reported her actions to law enforcement because they found her comments so alarming, sources said. How amazing is that, by the way? I wonder what the political leanings of those people were, because honestly, pre-election, there wasn't nearly the same level of, as Trump Jr. puts it, anti-Russia hysteria. I'm genuinely curious. I don't know. I couldn't tell you off the bat what my guess would be about what kind of student, more conservative or more liberal, at American University would be reporting classmates as suspected Russian spies. Interesting. In her final months at American University, the FBI raided her apartment. Then they arrested her in July. Maybe it was post-election. Who knows? By the time of her arrest, Butina had become the subject of a torrent of news coverage. You have upstaged Anna Chapman, Torsion wrote to Butina in March of 2017. I think we noted something quite like that earlier on. Let's see. The under-the-radar approach never seemed to suit Butina. Before moving to the U.S. for school, she was featured in a 2014 Russian GQ spread, wielding 2 handguns and sporting Dolce & Gabbana briefs, a leather trench, and stilettos. On a visit to the U.S. in July 2015, she attended a political event in Las Vegas, identified herself as a visitor from Russia, and asked then-candidate Trump whether he would pursue sanctions against her homeland. We remember all of that, too. Yeah, that was poorly staged. Anyway, It goes on at some length, but generally speaking, it was very interesting in terms of, her over-the-top style. There's a mention here, of course, of Paul Erickson. Also a mention, by the way, down here, she and Torsion were regular attendees at exclusive events surrounding the NRA's annual meetings. She had attended 2 national prayer breakfasts, yes, and 1 conservative political action conference. She attended a post-Thanksgiving barbecue. Who wants more food after Thanksgiving? Okay. Post-Thanksgiving barbecue at South Carolina Representative Mark Sanford's family farm. And he's supposedly turned himself into a never-Trumper. That guy, I don't know, maybe he wanted to go hiking. I don't know what to tell you. Anyway, she's all over the place. It's very interesting. Keep an eye on her. Well, now you can because she's in jail. It's an easy enough thing to do. Let's see. When investigators executed searches on Butina's and Erickson's homes, court documents reveal a note that investigators found in Erickson's handwriting, quote, how to respond to FSB offer of employment. Yes, I think we heard about that one too. Yeah, so she's all over the place. Mark Sanford too. All right, just noting that for the record. And by the way, the National Prayer Breakfast thing, that was something else that came up this morning via Twitter, watching Senator Coons tweeting his sort of semi-accusations Donald Trump's way. In particular, well, let's see, the tweet shouldn't be too far down here. I've been hearing Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani claiming that collusion is not a crime. Well, I took the liberty of reading the U.S. Code myself. Here's what the law actually says, and I'm sure it was very informative, a 1 minute and 52-second video that Senator Coons attaches to this, but I did want to see if we could get through to him and suggest perhaps, respectfully, sir, maybe not co-chairing the National Prayer Breakfast anymore. You might want to, extricate yourself from that situation. All right. Other things going on that need attention. There are a million. One more Russia story. Big splash yesterday made by The Guardian. Nick Hopkins. This story, suspected Russian spy found working at U.S. Embassy in Moscow. No big deal. Exclusive. This Russian is understood to have had full access to secret data during a decade at the embassy. That sounds bad too. U.S. counterintelligence investigators discovered a suspected Russian spy had been working undetected in the heart of the American embassy in Moscow for more than a decade, The Guardian has learned. And so to the extent that we hear about this today and anywhere else, or say from Donald Trump, it will be, why didn't President Obama do anything? I'm sure. The Russian national had been hired by the U.S. Secret Service and is understood to have had access to the agency's intranet and email systems, which gave her a potential window into highly confidential material, including the schedules of the president and the vice president. And that would be more valuable than ever now because they also own them. The woman had been working for the Secret Service for years before she came under suspicion in 2016, a pivotal year. During a routine security sweep conducted by 2 investigators from the U.S. Department of State's Regional Security Office, or RSO. I'm sure their budget's being slashed as we speak. They established she was having regular and unauthorized meetings with members of the FSB, Russia's principal security agency. That sounds like a bad thing to do if you're working for the American Embassy. The Guardian has also been told the RSO sounded the alarm in January of 2017, but the Secret Service did not launch a full-scale inquiry of its own. Instead, it decided to let her go quietly months later, possibly to contain any potential embarrassment. Oh well. An intelligence source told The Guardian the woman was dismissed last summer after the State Department revoked her security clearance. Ironically enough. The dismissal came shortly before a round of expulsions of U.S. personnel demanded by the Kremlin after Washington imposed more sanctions on the country. The order to remove more than 750 U.S. personnel from its 1,200-strong diplomatic mission is understood to have provided cover for her removal. The Secret Service is trying to hide the breach by firing her, the source said. The damage was already done, but the senior management of the Secret Service did not conduct any internal investigation to assess the damage and to see if she recruited any other employees to provide her with more information. Only an intense investigation by an outside source can determine the damage she has done. And that's how the story flips back, of course, to Donald Trump. Why didn't President Obama discover this? Why didn't he do anything? Well, that woman was actually working undercover. I don't know how difficult it would have been to discover her, but once they did, and it was clear that something needed to be done, it was too late. We had transitioned into the Trump administration and the Secret Service under Trump, with the option before them of conducting a thorough investigation to try to figure out whether there were any other spies in the embassy, declined to do so for some strange reason. Asked detailed questions about the investigation into the woman and her dismissal, the Secret Service attempted to downplay the significance of her role. She was a coffee girl, right? But it did not deny that she had been identified as a potential mole. In a statement, it said, the U.S. Secret Service recognizes that all Foreign Service nationals, FSN, they have their own acronym, who provide services in furtherance of our mission, administrative or otherwise, can be subjected to foreign intelligence influence. This is of particular emphasis in Russia. As such, all Foreign Service nationals are managed accordingly to ensure that Secret Service and United States government interests are protected at all times. As a result, the duties are limited to translation, interpretation, cultural guidance, liaison, and administrative support. That would make some sense, don't you think? It was specifically the duties of the FSN position in Moscow to assist our attachés and agency by engaging the Russian government, including the Russian Federal Security Service, or FSB, the Russian Ministry of the Interior, the MVD, and the Russian Federal Protective Service, the FSO, in furtherance of Secret Service interests. It said, at no time in any U.S. Secret Service office have FSNs been provided or placed in a position to obtain national security information. Well, I hope not, but it sounds like this one was. The State Department said it would not comment on allegations related to intelligence or personnel matters, and we have no information for you on this alleged incident. But it did say it was aware that U.S. government employees, by virtue of their employment with the U.S. government, thank you for that additional phrase that means nothing in addition to what you said first, may be targeted by foreign intelligence services. When we identify an employee in violation of security directives, we take appropriate action at the appropriate time. Secret Service is a U.S. federal law enforcement agency. Remember, this is the Guardian here. We know that. That sits within the Department of Homeland Security and has more than 150 offices worldwide. Its mission, it says, is the protection of the nation's leaders and the financial and critical infrastructure of the United States. Used to be in Treasury. For that reason, the discovery of a suspected FSB mole on its staff within the U.S. Embassy in Moscow would be hugely damaging to its reputation and could have severe consequences for the safety of other Secret Service staff and those it is mandated to protect. The Guardian has been told the name of the suspected spy and her job title within the agency. She did not respond to numerous email requests to discuss her role at the embassy or the allegations made against her. It is understood she came under suspicion 2 years ago during a routine review of Secret Service personnel in the so-called Paris district of the agency, which includes Moscow, London, and Frankfurt. It's a big district. The RSO reviews take place every 5 years. With a role that gave her an insight into ongoing Secret Service investigations, the woman had access to the Secret Service intranet, its internal email, and its counterfeit money tracking system. Oh, I wonder if the, not oligarchs, but mob bosses wanted that information. A source claimed her frequent contacts with the FSB gave her away. Numerous unsanctioned meetings and communications. These guys have to stop wearing FSB hats. The Guardian has been told that the State Department's resident agents in charge alerted the Secret Service in January 2017. That was the Donald Trump era by then. And at least 9 high-ranking Secret Service officials became aware of the findings. At the time, separate CIA and FBI inquiries were also underway, but it appears the Secret Service was expected to take the lead. It failed to do so. According to a source, she had access to the most damaging database, which is the U.S. Secret Service official mail system. Hey, Russia, if you're listening. Part of her access was schedules of the president, current and past, vice president, and their spouses, including Hillary Clinton. What? I can't believe it. Yeah, well, anyway. The point is, apparently that happened. Yeah, I don't know. That sounded less dramatic by the time that music came up. Anyway, why would you have that on the computer in Moscow? I mean, you can't limit that information and say, look, if it's being accessed from Moscow, you're going to have to enter another password. Who wants to know what the past president's schedule here in the United States is in Moscow? I don't think that makes any sense. But okay, she had plenty of time to gather intelligence without supervision, the source said. Several employees interacted with her on a personal level by emailing her personally on a non-work account. This isn't allowed, just like Mike Flynn. The Department of Homeland Security was apparently notified about the case, but it's unclear how much detail was passed on to officials outside the agency. It's also unclear why the woman, a Russian national, was hired by the Secret Service in the first place, or what kind of vetting took place. The Guardian has been told that the potential breach was not reported to any of the congressional intelligence or oversight committees. What would they do with it? A source said a government committee needs to investigate the Secret Service for hiding this breach. I think there's a lot of investigating that needs to be done about that one. Another option would be to include it in a special counsel, under Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation. The U.S. Congress is focusing on Russian hackers when it is possible, and here's how the connection would be made. The U.S. Congress isn't focusing on Russian hackers. Democrats are. Republicans are refusing to focus on that. But rather than focusing on Russian hackers, this source says, it is possible that all of the information they needed to get into the system came from the internal breach in the Secret Service. And I would think maybe Republicans, Russians/Republicans, whatever, in Congress might want to investigate that. They could probably try and turn that into another Benghazi because they would just blame Obama for that one. Her activities of stealing and sharing information could shed more light on how the Russians were able to hack the 2016 presidential election office of the DNC. They added, I think that the special counsel would be the perfect outside entity to investigate the level of damage that she caused. They have access to all types of counterintelligence information, and they wouldn't lie to avoid reporting this serious operational and security breach. Well, one hopes not. That's an interesting twist. I haven't seen any reaction to that from out of Mueller's office, and it's not likely you ever would. Even if he was interested in it, I don't know why he would discuss it and talk about it. That's just the nature of the way he conducts business there in his office. But an interesting idea and an interesting implication. All right. Many other directions to go in here. And I'm looking for the proper transition to this. I mean, here's, although, maybe this makes a good transition piece. I don't think we need to read the whole thing, but we ought to take note of the headline and gist of it. It might answer the question about what to do about this with respect to Mueller's interest in it. CNN story from Wednesday, Erica Orden reporting it. Exclusive, Mueller refers foreign agent inquiries to New York prosecutors. What are we talking about here? He has referred a collection of cases to New York prosecutors concerning whether several high-profile American lobbyists and operatives failed to register their work as foreign agents, according to people familiar with the matter. And a lot of this would have probably grown out of the whole Maria Butina / National Prayer Breakfast thing, but there are plenty of others who have been under some suspicion for some time, even before that story broke. The transfer of the inquiries marks an escalation of Mueller's referrals to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York in the period since he turned over a case involving Trump's personal attorney, Michael Cohen. Since the spring, Mueller has referred matters to SDNY involving longtime Democratic lobbyist Tony Podesta and his work for his former firm, the Podesta Group, and former Minnesota Republican Representative Vin Weber, whose name comes up again, and his work for Mercury Public Affairs, the sources said. One source said that former Obama White House counsel Greg Craig, a former partner at law firm Skadden Arps, Slate, Mager, and Flom, is also part of the inquiry. Just Skadden Arps for short, really, here in D.C. None of the entities involved have been charged with wrongdoing, and there is no indication the SDNY inquiry will result in any criminal charges. But I guess we'll just break it off here by saying, I suppose that there's, the fact that she was a Russian national working in Russia in the U.S. Embassy, I don't know that there's any nexus to the Southern District of New York here for this one. I mean, he might send it elsewhere. He might not have any interest in it. He might have to keep it in-house if he doesn't. I don't know whether he trusts the U.S. Attorney. Who would take this? D.C.? I don't know. Good question. Don't know whether really that's predictive of what would happen if Mueller were to take an interest in investigating what went on in the embassy. That's a good question. He might not have anybody to refer to and might have to keep it for that reason. Anyway, I was looking for more transition pieces, but I don't know that we're going to find them. Oh, yes. There was this other piece we started the other day about Butina, the accused Russian spy who told American CEO, send cash to Moscow. That was the one where we read about the guy who was supposedly this legendary businessman of whom we had never heard, this very aged-looking person. And yes, Hank Greenberg, Maurice Hank Greenberg. What was the name of the person in the other article? Was it not the same? I mean, Henry Greenberg. Is that what they said? I'm going to go back and look at that article. That was this first Butina piece, right? Now we read the one with the Scud missile reference in it. I got to scroll down. Now I got to settle this for myself. I hope I can find it without wasting too much time. Let's see. Henry Greenberg. I'm like a Russian man who went by Henry Greenberg, but this isn't a Russian man. That's interesting. Henry Greenberg. And am I wrong about this? Just flipping back and forth between the articles here. Hank Greenberg. All right. So, Hank is a, nickname for Henry, but I guess there's a lot of Greenbergs around, and they all are mixed up with Maria Butina. She just might have a thing for Henrys and Hanks, for all I know. Okay. Just putting that out there. So, I don't know if there's any decent segue. We're just going to have to shift gears on things. And there's two main themes I wanted to put out there. And I don't know which one makes the most sense. Perhaps this one. I spoke a little bit the other day, and for a long time really, about the dangers of confirming Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, and about all the things that can change if there's a fifth arbitrary conservative vote on the Supreme Court. And I told you that it's something that I'd been paying attention to for a long time, and I wanted to dig that up. I tweeted a series of comments the other day about Kavanaugh and the danger that he posed, and dug up some old articles of mine, old posts of mine from Daily Kos from years back. And it was surprising to me as I reread them how, in some cases, some passages seemed so relevant to what was going on today, so I thought I'd share them. I'm just going to have to dump this on you. I was reacting the other day to a tweet from Brian Fallon, executive director of We Demand Justice, saying or commenting on a New York Times piece here. Bush claimed power to override a torture ban. What did Brett Kavanaugh? What does the headline say? It's not all in the. What did Brett Kavanaugh think about that? And this was the claim the power to override the torture ban. And Fallon's tweet about it was new. New York Times uncovers Kavanaugh played key role as staff secretary, remember that, in Bush's controversial signing statements. I used to play a role in that, where he claimed the power to ignore hundreds of laws. I used to harp on that all the time. And by the way, not everybody thought I was barking up the right tree about that one. This is a perfect example of why the Senate must see the records from Kavanaugh's full-time working for Bush, and that's still a point of controversy. They're fighting about that in the Judiciary Committee now. I believe the status of things is that the National Archives, the Republicans on the Judiciary Committee have, in public they've said, we agree with the Democrats that there ought to be a thorough investigation of Kavanaugh's time and the papers he left behind from his time in the Bush White House. but we don't think that you should get everything, essentially. And besides, it's going to take an awful long time and yada, yada. But they did accede to allowing some of those papers to be pulled from the National Archives. The Archives now says it'll be months before we even get this partially taken care of. He left a lot of paper behind. He was staff secretary. He had his hands in every paper. So it's very difficult to pull everything that he ever did and do a thorough job of it. But as a result, the Republicans on the Judiciary Committee now say, well, we can't wait that long. We got to have the vote before the elections for some reason, which seems like I don't know. I guess they figure they'll lose the ability to confirm him at some point. So that is why. I mean, I do know why. And you know why too. But what's going to end up happening, as Dianne Feinstein is complaining about, is they're going to force a vote before they can even produce that small part of the papers that they archives said they can come up with on a relatively quick basis. So what's not going to be presented to Democrats on the committee? Well, in part, it'll be some of this. And it's a rather startling position. It was startling then, and it's startling to be reminded of it now. Kavanaugh, what role did he play as he was a prominent constitutional attorney at the time, though he, hadn't risen to prominence in his own right. But people who clerk at that level and move in those circles, generally speaking, are spending an awful lot of time on those issues and have something to say about it, crazy or otherwise. And he's the guy shuffling the papers around and offering up some legal opinion, I guess, about whether or not the president, when it's a Republican, anyway, can use signing statements to ignore duly adopted legislation from the Congress, including, up to and including, a ban on torture. And that was a big issue at the time, and, I recognize that you recognize it. I wrote an awful lot about it, and the idea that there really just basically was no rule of law to be had if you adopted a position like this, that the president could ignore these laws and could obviate them with a simple signing statement, is an extraordinarily radical view of the role of the rule of law and the role of the judiciary. But there's more to it. I'll talk about after this. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Only had to make you wait a minute to get to the exciting series of tweets that I offered up about this thing. So it was a good find. I mean, it's a good story over at the New York Times, and we probably really should spend time reading it. Charlie Savage wrote it, and therefore you ought to read it. I mean, really, it comes down to that. Charlie Savage covered the signing statements issues like nobody else at the time, and I believe it ended up, that's how he ended up landing at the New York Times. I think he was reporting for the Boston Globe originally, and he was just really killing it on that subject, and the Times brought him on. And I feel like I'm shortchanging everybody by not reading the whole Charlie Savage piece, but we just haven't got the time. So I recommend it to you. Bush claimed power to override a torture ban. What did Brett Kavanaugh think about that is the title of the piece, July 29th in the New York Times. And, I would read you the lead, except it's pretty clear from the title. I guess maybe, what if we skip down a paragraph or two just to sort of set the table? Judge Kavanaugh, who at the time was White House staff secretary, acknowledged handling draft signing statements to ensure that relevant members of the administration had provided input before presenting them to Mr. Bush. But the nominee sidestepped questions about any advice or views he had about them, refusing to discuss internal matters and pivoting instead to a description of a 1952 Supreme Court opinion that explains how to analyze separation of powers disputes in general. Now that President Trump has nominated Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, the opacity of his testimony about Mr. Bush's signing statements, this was his statements earlier when he was first nominated to the court, the opacity of his testimony about Bush's signing statements, including about the torture ban, is becoming a case study for Democrats' vehement arguments that the Senate must see his staff secretary files before any confirmation hearing. Democrats have already been raising concerns that Kavanaugh may hold too expansive a view of executive power in other contexts, like his skepticism about the wisdom of forcing a president to answer questions in criminal investigations. That was troubling enough all by itself. But it gets worse in my view, and in Brian Fallon's view, and in Charlie Savage's view too. Here's what I was talking about the other day, though. Let's get to that. I was saying, I would say that voting to confirm Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court is an act of congressional suicide. And I mean it this way. You're confirming a fifth conservative vote to the Supreme Court, and a vote in particular that does not acknowledge limits on the power of the presidency. And remember, here we're talking about three supposedly co-equal branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial, right? You're sending someone to the judicial branch whose mission in life, it appears, is to rule that there is no power that the legislative branch can possibly hold over the executive branch, with the possible, and I'm not even sure he would agree, possible exception of impeachment. In other words, that the legislative branch has no power to compel the president to do anything, legally or otherwise, because he can simply sign that power away with a signing statement that says, I ignore what you have to say. That's extraordinarily dangerous, and I think everybody should recognize that. But I was going to say it's an act of congressional suicide, because why would you place someone on the Supreme Court who will obviate your power vis-a-vis the executive branch? One day, the occupant of the executive branch is going to be somebody from the other party, and you're not going to like that. But, I guess they just don't anticipate that ever happening again. And it reminded me of my own view of the issue way back forever, really, but say 2005 through 2009 or so. It was a very long, protracted period particularly during the second administration of George W. Bush, where that was an enormous issue. And I said as much, and actually got the opportunity to say as much directly to President Obama, who more or less poo-pooed the whole thing, as much of the Democratic establishment did at the time. And I was reminding, now at that time, in 2009, my big argument was, in the running contest as between the legislative branch and the executive branch with respect to the conduct of war fighting, the conduct of detainee policy resulting from those wars, torture policy, detainee policy, the conduct of war itself, homeland security, national security, warrantless wiretapping and surveillance that went along with the, hand in hand with national security, that it was clearly the belief of Republicans that executive power ought to be expanded and maintained, because they, I think at the time, simply anticipated winning the presidency forever. Now, it seemed like that would be a stupid thing to anticipate in the immediate wake of the election of Barack Obama. But remember, these were the days when Mitch McConnell and others had as their overt goal making Obama a one-term president. They viewed the election of not just Barack Obama, but of any Democrat as an anomaly that they could do away with. They shortly learned that they were wrong about that, but then they found the magic ingredient, apparently, that they needed: Russian assistance. And now the most unlikely and unqualified Republican ever to be produced is now president and stands in danger of being reelected once again. Maybe, if he was elected the first time. Who knows? Anyway, I did make this point to them. At that time, in 2009, the presidential election was one which Republicans had become overly accustomed to winning. And I drew a line, for the purposes of illustrating the point, at the Nixon administration, because, of course, that was the last one that had had equally expansive views of presidential power, that if the president does it, it isn't illegal. This is where all this came from. And the lines are direct, and you don't need to, do any kind of scholarly comparison of the rhetoric. A lot of the players were the same. And that since Nixon's initial election and then re-election, followed by, after his resignation, by for the balance of his term, Gerald Ford. Then the election post-Watergate, the first election held 1976. Okay, so obviously they're not going to be terrifically popular, the Republicans. Democratic candidate Jimmy Carter wins. Guess what? They embark on a program, no doubt, to make sure that Jimmy Carter is a one-term president, and voila, he is, followed by 2 terms of Ronald Reagan, 1 term of George H.W. Bush. America finally realizing, oh my God, it's been Republican forever, and we never really punished anybody for Watergate, and et cetera, et cetera. So fine, Bill Clinton, 2 terms. Great, glad to have won the White House twice in a row, better than what we would have had, I'm sure. And then immediately thereafter, screw that whole thing. Let's have George H.W. Bush's son, W, be president for 2 terms. So Nixon, 2 terms. Throw Ford in there, right? And then Carter, 1 term. Then Reagan, 2 terms, followed by Bush for a 3rd term of Reagan, followed by, thankfully, 2 terms of Democrat Bill Clinton, but then followed again by 2 terms of George H.W. Bush. So what are we talking about? 8 presidential terms Republican, 3 presidential terms for Democrats. And by the way, so all of the Republican terms saw progressive reinstatement of the Nixon doctrine along the way. So yes, there were 3 terms of Democrats in all this, and we're thankful for it. And we were beginning a 4th term there, so that would bring us up to 50% of the rate of occupancy of the White House at long last, now that Barack Obama was in there. But prior to his election, we were looking at 8 Republican terms and 3 Democratic terms, and an increase in the audacity of the imperial powers claimed by the executive, and a whole, legal doctrine being invented to justify it along the way. And, as great as it was to have a 2-term Democratic president in there at one point, don't look too much into it, because as the Republicans continued to expand their idea of presidential power and fight like mad against any expansion of presidential powers when Democrats were in office, and all this time, who got impeached in all this? In this 8, 9, 10, 11 terms we're talking about. 8 Republicans, 3 Democrats. One ends up being crushed by Ronald Reagan and 1 termed out. The other one survives but gets impeached. All the Republicans are doing, all the, after Watergate, the reinstatement of expanded presidential powers through Reagan and H.W. Bush and then W, the impeachment is Bill Clinton. And for what? Yeah, you all know the story. On the other hand, prior to the anomaly of the quote-unquote Republican Revolution in a box, conducted by Newt Gingrich, and then the sort of back and forth that's gone on since then, having lost the majority in the House of Representatives and in the Senate in the mid-90s, but then regaining it in the mid-2000s, at least briefly, before relinquishing it again, unfortunately. But now we're at a point where it's going to go back and forth for a while until it flops to one side again. But prior to that, Democrats had held the majority in the House for 40 plus years. It was a huge talking point for Newt Gingrich. It's time for a change. They've been ruling for 40 years. Look what's happening to the country, blah, blah, blah. That was his spiel. And the Senate, Democrats didn't hold the majority in the Senate for all of that time, but they very rarely did lose that majority and very rarely lost it by very many seats. And so what I was trying to tell them was, in the power struggle, the continuing power struggle between Congress and the White House, at that time anyway, what it looked like historically, what the institutional advantage was to Democrats in the legislative branch and to Republicans in the executive branch. That has changed somewhat with the re-election of Barack Obama. And so the number of years spent in the White House began to equalize. The number of terms won by Democrats was beginning to become more equal. It was 8-3, but then you have to then throw in the 2 terms from Obama, and now you got 8-5. Of course, now it's 9-5 with the election of Donald Trump. Still not so good. And Republicans challenging, of late anyway, the ability of Democrats to regain and hold a majority for any extended period of time. But at the time you were looking at, the lines were much clearer. And I thought, well, ought it not to be a Democratic strategy then to be certain that wherever we found the opportunity to fight to restore the balance between the 2 branches, we shift it back perhaps towards the legislative branch and make sure that we rein in the executive. But of course, that was a difficult thing to convince the then executive to do. And so, well, we didn't make very much in the way of inroads there. So now, though, charging on and then beginning to look back at what I wrote then, which was something that, the president wasn't particularly interested in, looking back at the time, here's what's going on. I would say, as I said before, that voting to confirm Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court is an act of congressional suicide. The man was going to sit on the Supreme Court and decide in favor of the executive in every contest between the executive and the legislative branch. So in that sense, yes, congressional suicide to put this guy there who will, nail the coffin shut on the legislative branch. But it's not really congressional suicide. You know how we get upset when the headlines say Congress rejects blah, blah, blah. And it wasn't Congress per se that rejected something. It was Republicans. It was a party line vote. All the Democrats in Congress were for it. Republicans were against it. Republicans reject ... Remember, Barack Obama himself used to make this quote-unquote mistake all the time. So it's not really so much an act of congressional suicide as it is, 1, Republican, and 2, not suicide at all. It's murder. What was I talking about just a minute ago? Traditionally speaking, Republicans view national politics this way. The presidency is ours. And for now, anyway, the Congress is ours too. Yes, it was traditionally Democratic, but most of the people in Congress now for Republicans don't even remember the days when Democrats were in the majority. There are very few of those people left. And a lot of, increasingly more and more Republicans elected to Congress aren't even politicians in the traditional sense. They're candidates in a box, and they go out and looking for people who don't have political experience and can therefore be led around by the nose. So they don't have any institutional understanding or memory of the institution they're serving in either. But they view it, generally speaking, as it's a lot easier to concentrate on winning one big giant election that you can spend millions, hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars on, particularly now that you can do so much of it dark and so much money gets spent that it's just hard to keep track of it all. And it's a lot easier to track it down in a smaller congressional race. And there's hundreds of those. It's so annoying. Why don't we just win one election and then, even if we continue to lose Congress, so what? We can obviate everything they do with a signing statement. This is a much more preferable situation. Just concentrate on winning the one election that can erase everything the other 535 elections have to say about the matters at hand. That was their generalized approach to governance. Bet it all on the presidency. So, of course, Republicans are going to murder Congress along the way. So, yeah, it's not Congress doing it to itself. It's Republicans doing it to Congress in case Congress should ever fall back into Democratic hands. So, again, to call it congressional suicide, though that was my initial inclination, ignores a very partisan element of a very partisan power play. It's not suicide by Congress. It's murder by Republicans. Voting to confirm as a justice the White House lawyer, Kavanaugh, who convinced the president that he had a constitutional right to ignore statutory bans on torture, is to surrender the entirety of the legislative branch, the entirety of Article 1 of the Constitution. If you, as Republicans, aim to win, or even, let's say, rig, one election, your power becomes unlimited. Under their theory of governance, right? It's the Republican theory of governance. So what the president says goes. So how many elections do you have to win? One and only one. And I said, I feel like I've discussed this before. And here I started quoting from an earlier blog post. And it's some of it is bits and pieces, but it's all straight out of one or two pieces that I link to later on. And here's I say I feel like I've discussed this before. The discussion I had in mind really was my discussion with other activists, and the president in the cabinet room sitting around that table in May of 2009 and laying this all out. Look, man, they win the presidency almost all the time. We used to win the Congress all the time. So obviously in the contest as between the legislative branch and the executive branch, it's going to be the Republican theory that the executive branch wins. Now you're in control of the executive branch, and normally branches don't give power back. And it's a big thing to ask you to have, now having gained this power, to start giving it back. But let's do it in controlled fashion. For instance, don't torture anybody. That was something you didn't want to do anyway. Couldn't we do something about that? Or couldn't we at least put a lid on things and say, okay, it may not necessarily limit executive power, but let's at least impose this limit on executive power. If you abuse executive power to this extent and torture people, there will be accountability. Well, no, was what he said. You're speaking euphemistically, he said to me. You want trials. You want people to be put on trial. You want, and then when we got into the whole look back thing, and then everything was lost at that point. But anyway, not to linger on that too much. I did feel like I had discussed this before, and I had done so on the blog as well. It's not just, I wrote, that torture has become an acceptable tool to Republicans. It's that it is now a tenet of Republican political philosophy that illegal and unconstitutional practices can be sterilized by order of the president. Now, you know that they believe this in the current White House, absolutely. And you know that they'll be upheld at the constitutional level in the Supreme Court if Brett Kavanaugh lands on the Supreme Court. But this was about a very different situation. It just feels the same. It's not just that torture has become an acceptable tool to Republicans. It's that it's now an actual part of Republicans' governing political philosophy. A, you got to have torture that you actually believe. And B, it's okay, even if it is blatantly unconstitutional, we can make it unconstitutional by order of the president. The question of whether or not the president now shall have unlimited power to order extra-legal actions of any kind and then excuse them by fiat, we are urged to believe, is now one that we settle at the ballot box. It's a political question. The court can't help you with this at best. Now, that was something the courts avoided this question as a political question when they had only 4 votes for validating the president's view of these things, which had much the same effect as validating his view of those things, with very rare exceptions. In Nixon's own cases about the tapes. But since then, nothing. Or very little, anyway. Now, there would be 5 votes to simply say, oh, it's not a political question. It's a very easy judicial question, and the answer is whatever the president wants to do. But up until that point, we have been urged something equally dumb, to believe something equally dumb, that this is a political question. We just vote. Look, there's an accountability moment. Is torture legal? Can the president legalize it? Well, go vote and find out. We're going to have a referendum on the legalization of torture now. This leaves us in what position? Every 4 years, America shall decide anew whether or not there are any limitations on the power of the federal government. I.e., there are some, there are plenty when there's a Democrat in the White House, and there are none when there are Republicans in the White House. Why? Because Republicans don't recognize any, and to this point, the courts haven't been willing to force them to do so. And now they will overtly be interested in validating their view of it. And they will not be shy about denying the same power to Democrats. They are now an openly partisan institution. Don't forget it. And so we're now going to be going back and forth. We're going to have a different constitution every 4 years. looks like the same one, says the same things, but depending on who wins the presidency, some things are unconstitutional, other things aren't. What about precedent? What about stare decisis? To hell with it. Who gives a crap? Kavanaugh doesn't. He's very open about it. To the extent that other people cling to stupid stuff like that, it's my clerk's business to figure out what the distinction is between this case and that one. I know how I'm supposed to vote, and I'm gonna. And I don't even have to give an answer. And if my clerks won't help me, to hell with them. Screw it. Nothing says I need clerks. No one says I have to give an explanation. That's just tradition. Screw that too. Eventually, you'll see. Every 4 years, America shall decide anew whether or not there are any limitations on the power of the federal government. Now, look, as tiresome as it can sometimes be, I even knew it then, to see people frame matters so that it all comes down to one issue and one issue only. Pick your issue. Doesn't matter. You know how annoying that is. Nothing's worth, why bother yourself with the Supreme Court if the planet is going to roast? Well, okay, true, good point. Why worry about the planet roasting if there's nothing you can do about it? Because even if you pass laws, they can be obviated by a stroke of the pen. Well, that's true too. Take your pick. As tiresome as that can be, right? I find myself returning to this one again and again. Whether or not torture is your issue, or wiretapping, or indefinite detention, or signing statements, or anything really. Environment, global warming, abortion, healthcare, taxes, terrorism, the various wars. I only had one in mind at the time. There was only one. No matter what your issue is, at heart, you are dependent on a continuing and consistent respect for the law, the rule of law. Without it, you haven't got much, right? Because without it, none of your work on politics and policy is worth anything. The moment the White House falls to someone, essentially, who's not you, you might have an ally in there. Great. What if he disagrees with you one day? Remember, that's what we were finding out very frequently with the last Democratic president. It did happen from time to time. It's normal. Doesn't make him a bad president. It just does happen. You will eventually find yourself in disagreement with even a White House in your own party. Now, you can pass all the environmental laws you want, but if it's accepted as a legitimate tenet of Republican governing philosophy, that all of those laws can be safely ignored or otherwise set aside, you will have gained absolutely nothing from all of your work, even with a friendly Congress and friendly administration. Why, look at all these great things we did during the Obama administration. Well, take a look at the healthcare thing. You could have improved that dramatically, I know, but on the whole, it's a net positive. I think we can mostly agree with that. Well, who cares if you can just have a president waltz into office and say, to hell with it. The law says I have to pay for these things. I won't. Law says I have to provide this report. I won't. Law says I can't just defund this thing. I will. Who cares? You will have gained nothing from all your work, because who cares what the work is? I don't care what the Congress says. I can sign it away. And if you can set aside all statutory and constitutional law on something like torture, I am unsure what barriers you might think remain in the way of doing the same for any other issue. Oh, they wouldn't do that on healthcare, on domestic policy, on global warming. Well, they would. They could. Why wouldn't they? If you can do it on torture, you can do it on anything. Torture, and more importantly, the insane unitary executive theory, remember when they used to use that term? The unitary executive theory that underpinned it, and 1,000 other abuses just like it, remains a viable and so far undisputed weapon in the Republican toolkit. That we have complained about it. Others have written about it. But honestly, what's on the record so far from courts or other things that are supposed to matter that says, yeah, the unitary executive theory is garbage. Anyone who brings it up should get laughed out of court. Nothing. And it's still happening. And the reason it'll come back up in court again is we're about to put a fifth justice on the Supreme Court who believes it's true. I told you, you're all just pre-wrong. So, this unitary executive thing, I said then, it will return as surely as the Republican theory of total executive supremacy survived Watergate and Iran-Contra. Oh, yes, it did do that, didn't it? We thought we did something about that thing then. We thought we did it at Watergate. Then it came back as Iran-Contra. Then it came back as warrantless wiretapping. Then it came back as torture. And guess what? It's back now, and Donald Trump has it in his arsenal. It will return just as surely as it did in the past. What was the date of the piece? May 4th, 2009. In my preparation, I hadn't even know that it was going to happen yet. But later on, within a couple of weeks, I would be sitting around the cabinet table making the same argument to the president and everybody else. Didn't really buy it. But it's looking a lot better these days. May 4th, 2009, under the title Torture May Be Necessary in the Future. Back at the old Daily Kos. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Hope I'm not upsetting you too much, but you're at Netroots Nation, hopefully, and maybe there's something you can do about all this and have this as part of your discussion. Or maybe you're sitting alone in your home, like I am, frustrated to no end. However, something, don't give up hope. How's that? That wasn't very helpful. Anyway, a couple of notes coming in, observations. Matthew Rigdon enjoying the conversation, I think. I can't quite tell. Or maybe just frustrating him to no end. Karen D, offering this, this is a good piece of advice for programming purposes. Would be great if you reminded folks of why you were able to talk to Obama. Like, what the hell? That's a good question. Now, you may have in the past, but I've forgotten. And I don't know whether I have in the past. I've forgotten, too. It's nearing the point where I now forget why. But very good point. I really ought to do that. Why was I able to talk to Obama? And the reason, you want me to get philosophical about it or give the basic nuts and bolts reason? I can give you both. The philosophical reason is you. That is to say, I was there as a representative of Daily Kos. And that only happens because millions of you read and are influenced by Daily Kos, and the people in the White House recognized that as a serious thing, which wasn't always the case for them. And not everybody agreed that it was a particularly serious thing, that Daily Kos was widely read and influential. But let's see. Reason number two, philosophical, or no, I'll say maybe the nuts and bolts reason. There was one person who had the, relative influence and pull to make that happen. Jesse Lee was working in the Obama White House, and I guess he worked there for the entirety of the administration, which is a rare thing. He had been the blogger for the DCCC prior. He'd been working in Democratic politics for a little while, and I guess moved on to the campaign. And Obama wins, and he finds the opportunity to move to the White House, and he parlays his blogging and connections to the Netroots wisely from his point of view, and wisely from the point of view of the Obama administration. They decided, we do need to pay some attention to what's going on in the burgeoning blogosphere, even though it was pretty obviously the case that Barack Obama himself didn't have any special place in his heart for, or any real confidence in the I don't know, certainly in the political influence, but also in the intellectual capacity of the blogosphere. And I guess that's easy enough to come to doubt sometimes. If you read the right, or I should say wrong parts of the blogosphere, it's easy to come to the conclusion that it's not particularly worthy sometimes. But somewhere in the administration, they said, okay, well, politically speaking, it is influential, even if you think they're a bunch of idiots. And we really do have to do something to cultivate our relationship here. And so they gave Jesse the latitude to do it. And the president was getting set to deliver an address, and I forget where he did it, but sometime this would be late May, I'm going to say May 20th, 2009. And for some reason, it comes to mind, did he give the speech at the National Archives? Is that where he did it? But he gave an address on detainee policy, was the major thrust of it. And so the White House political operation convened a meeting of various activists and academics on the subject of detainee policy, torture policy, etc., and what to do, how to deal with what had been handed over from the previous administration. And the ACLU was on hand for that. Various the Center for Constitutional Rights was on hand for that. A couple of academics, as I recall off the top of my head, Jeffrey Stone from University of Chicago, that he knew from his days at Chicago, was there. A number of other folks, and a number of representatives of the White House as well, and the administration. The Attorney General was there. Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel was there. Was he Chief of Staff at the time? And generally speaking, a broad cross-section of interest groups and political influence groups and academics brought together to sort of discuss the whole thing. Why public relations / sure, the president would like some input on these things. So we went and we did it. I almost didn't go. I was on vacation at the time. And I got a call from Jesse Lee. Hey, how would you like to come to this meeting? And I said, sounds good. When is it? And he said, tomorrow. And I said, I am on vacation. What am I going to do about that? I can't make it. And, I did. But I'm at the beach. I'm at the Outer Banks. It's not a million miles away, but I didn't want to stop being at the beach and go and sit in this meeting, which honestly, as great an opportunity as it is as a memory, I think even then I knew, all right, look, Barack Obama is not going to go, holy effing straight, you're right, blogger idiot. I changed my mind. Going to do some different things. That wasn't really what I expected. But I did feel like, well, that it is a unique opportunity. And Jesse put it pretty bluntly. Are you out of your mind? So come back. You're within driving distance. Come home. And you're going to say, nah, not going to talk to the president. But you know me, I don't buy into most of that opportunity. It's stupid. You got to take those opportunities. But yeah, I'm my own worst enemy. I shy away from that stuff to begin with. Plus, I'm not a big believer in these pivotal moments, whether it's listening to a speech or even the opportunity to talk to, the president. But I went. He was right. You don't skip the opportunity. I made my arrangements to get back. I actually, I was like, there's no way I'm driving. I can't. I'd have to leave now, for one thing, drive home, stay overnight at home, then commute an hour into D.C. and then make it there for the early morning meeting, and then back home, and then drive that. It's 6 hours, if you're lucky, is the drive. And I'd lose the whole vacation. And, that would suck. So I actually, I made arrangements. I flew home. I got like a little charter 3-seater plane to fly me to Dulles, which was a hell of an experience. And I went to the meeting. And that's it was written up. The meeting was written up by Michael Isikoff at Newsweek a few days after it took place. I don't rate any mention in it or anything. But, it was a hell of an experience. But it didn't do anything. But embitter me. But that's the answer. But yes, deep down, the answer is, the reason I got to talk to him is Jesse Lee was there in the White House and was sympathetic to the blogosphere. And, the reason that the blogosphere got included was because you guys are reading it. Matthew Rigdon says, I'd have respected you more if you'd skipped the meeting. Well, yeah. Although, like I said, the memory of and the flight was really cool. I think actually, quite honestly, the highlight of the whole thing was flying in that little teeny plane. If any of you have been to the Outer Banks, if you've been down, south past Duck's Head, but out onto like Hatteras Island, and if you've been down to, Buxton, Frisco area, there's a little airstrip there. I mean, literally just one airstrip between the dunes, Billy Mitchell Field. And I've always, whenever I've passed it on vacation here, I've dreamed of how fun, how cool would it be to fly in and out of that thing. And I got the opportunity. And I literally used to think to myself, what would justify paying for it? Because it's not cheap. Paying for the expense of chartering a plane to fly home back and forth. Because, the traffic is miserable. I always wished, wouldn't it be great to be able to just fly here and be back in 45 minutes it takes us basically to get between the Washington, D.C. area and the Outer Banks, rather than the 6 to 7 hours it can take trying to fight your way through traffic and driving. What fantasy, right? What would justify that expense? And I actually once thought, well, being summoned to the White House by the president, not that that would ever happen, would do the trick. And then I actually kind of got that call, and I still said, I don't know. I was on my way back from playing golf, like Donald Trump. We have this, and I was like, I'm tired. I don't want to just turn around. I'm in Nag's Head now. I got to travel an hour south to get my car, only to turn around and drive north again. This is not going to work out. I actually did think of skipping the meetings. And remember, though, in 2009, in March of 2009, we weren't yet, convinced that Barack Obama was going to be no help on the issue of setting the George W. Bush administration right. It was increasingly obvious, but there was still a chance. So I went. On the off chance that maybe a fresh look at the situation would convince somebody somewhere that somebody had to be prosecuted for something, even if it wasn't George Bush and Dick Cheney. So I went, and I was able to go. I was invited because of Daily Kos. I was able to attend because of Daily Kos. I begged, I pled with them. I said, I really do. I feel like I have to go to this meeting for us. And I had been invited, of course, in particular, because I had been writing so much about the signing statements and torture policy and detainee policy that, why me out of everyone from Daily Kos? I was supposedly in Washington. I wasn't at the time. And not a lot of us were. And two, that had been my issue. So I felt like I had to go. And they felt like the same. And thankfully, things were such that Daily Kos had more money on hand than I did. And they said, we'll pay for the flight. And so they did. And it was great. And I don't know what we got out of it, but, okay, we might have wasted our money on that one. But it's a great memory. That's it. All right. Returning, though, to the story. The reason I was there was because on May 4th, 2009, and for some time prior, I had been writing about the issue. So I had laid this argument out about 2 weeks before this meeting had taken place. And although Obama was never reading Daily Kos because we were all, not, whatever, intellectual or centrist enough, or we were hysterical bloggers, Jesse Lee was reading it. And so when somebody gave him the go-ahead to convene a meeting like this with activists from all stripes, and hey, why don't we get some of those nuts from the blogosphere in there, my name came up. Okay. So where we left off was the wind-up of that May 4th, 2009 piece. It will return, this idea of the unitary executive, will return as surely as the Republican theory of total executive supremacy survived Watergate and Iran-Contra. And again, this was a piece that I ran under the title of Torture, quote, may be necessary in the future. That was, of course, the quote from one of the Bush administration officials at the time, Dan Abrams, interviewing Bush attorneys general John Ashcroft and Alberto Gonzales. And again, basically, that's where the quote from. And I said, Abrams asks about the release of the torture memos, and Gonzales has this to say: they may be necessary in the future, and by disclosing it, those torture memos, that means you take them off the table and they can never be used again. They may be necessary in the future, is what he was saying. And I said, hey, that's an overt sign. They intend to do this again. And now we find ourselves in this position. One more vote on the Supreme Court. One more vote, Kavanaugh's vote. and torture isn't unconstitutional. Sure, it says cruel and unusual punishment, yada, 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 in the amendments. But what if 5 justices say that's not what it means? One more vote, and that's what happens. One more vote, and indefinite detention on the president's say-so alone isn't unconstitutional. One more vote, and warrantless wiretapping isn't unconstitutional. That was a bigger concern back in those days than it is now, but it's true. It's still an issue, right? One more vote, and all of this becomes fine. Why? Because 5 votes. But based on what? How dare you? How could you possibly say these things? I don't know. Who cares? Kiss my ass. 5 of us say we win. What are you going to do? Appeal? To who? This is the end. This is the whole thing right here. 5 of us say yes and give no reason. 5 of us say yes and say the reason is we don't like your ugly effing face. Valid law. What in the hell are you going to do about it? And Congress says, yep, we'd love to have that. That would be terrific because we think it's to our political partisan advantage. We will win. It won't make any sense for the country. We will be ungovernable from here on in. It will have, we don't want to turn the Senate into the House by getting rid of the filibuster. You just turned the Supreme Court into the House. And you're fine with it. Why? Because now you win the House all the time. And that's all that matters to you. So one more vote and all this is just not unconstitutional. You thought it was. You learned in Schoolhouse Rock it was. You learned in high school civics, maybe you didn't probably, that it was. Now it's not because you were wrong. You were pre-wrong. One more vote and everything that you thought you understood innately as an American about the nature of our system of government can just change. It's just different now. And worse, all the insane right-wing trolls who have astounded you over the years with their seemingly otherworldly interpretations of constitutional law, which you thought were completely off the wall. That's not constitutional. What are you talking about? Nothing in the law says that. They're all going to be right all of a sudden. And you, who was right all along, will now be wrong. You're just all of a sudden wrong. I was right. Ha ha. No, you cheated. That's not right. The law still doesn't say this. Well, look, it came out this way. It's the law now. All the insane right-wing trolls, as I said. And remember, this too is an old piece. I'm not talking about now insane right-wing trolls. This has been going on for a long time. All the insane right-wing trolls who have astounded you with their seemingly otherworldly interpretations of constitutional law will be right, and they will claim that they have always been right. But for the interference of liberal activist judges, they were doing fake law, just like fake news. Fake law, fake law. I was right the whole time. No, you weren't right at all, and you're barely right now, but now at least you have something to point to. It's fake. That's the fake law, just like the fake news. This is the fake law. No, you're the fake. There's no such thing, I continued on there, as compromise with people who believe that you and your so-called correct understanding of the Constitution and what it says and what it means is more properly viewed as being merely pre-wrong. I keep using that phrase, pre-wrong. And I wanted to try to go back to its origins. And even this isn't there. I think I used it even earlier than that. But this too, this one is from June 14th, 2008. In a piece I posted titled, "One Vote Away." At that time I was talking about the 5-4 decision in the case of Boumediene versus Bush. What did it mean? I was telling people then, in Republican land, it means everything the Supreme Court has told them they've been wrong about for the past 7 years is now one vote away from being suddenly right and then staying that way forever. It was a torture and detention case. But all of that's everything that they have said all along was now going to be right. And one thing I left out of that thing, and I wish I hadn't, this was the point I wanted to bring back, was that all the insane right-wing trolls who've always had this cockamamie idea of what the Constitution meant will say they've been right, and they've always been right, except the interference of liberal activist judges were making people think they were wrong when they really weren't. The line I left out, and they will laugh in your face when it happens. And you know they will, and you know they will now, but I'm just saying I knew they would in 2008, and I wish that more people had taken it seriously. So that's it. You're now pre-wrong, and when they have their fifth vote, you'll find out that you were wrong. Alberto Gonzalez came up in the last piece there about torture being necessary again. We're going to dip even further back in the well now. Here's another piece. This one from August 17th, 2006. So Gonzalez, then very relevant. Gonzalez and the gang believe that nothing applies to them unless the Supreme Court says specifically that it does, meaning them personally. They were already gaming the Supreme Court, of course, and already claiming that everybody else was pre-wrong. But in this case, they were basically saying this was a situation in which they kept going back to the Supreme Court with different versions of the same case, essentially, and saying, okay, so fine, the court ruled against us with respect to the detention of this prisoner. But that doesn't mean that a different prisoner with a different name has to go free. Now, that's normally the way people interpret things at the Supreme Court. Look, the logic is going to be the same for this guy as it is for that guy. Even if the fact pattern is slightly different, you can argue about the facts. But if it's established that the fact pattern is pretty much the same, the outcome is going to be the same. But the Bush administration never believed that. And they wanted to press the case, the same arguments in different cases. Oh, you said that guy had to be detained under certain conditions. You didn't say this guy had to be. So Gonzalez and his gang at the time believed that nothing applied to them, no ruling. I don't have to obey Supreme Court decisions about a different person. Boumediene hadn't happened yet, but Boumediene, okay, he wins his case, big deal. So somebody else tries to, enforce that same law. Yeah, you're not Boumediene. Screw you. All right. Well, that's what Gonzalez believed, and they don't have to do anything at all unless the Supreme Court says, hey, you, with respect to this guy, you have to do this. And should the court ever actually go ahead and do that, then their strategy would be to just keep changing the facts and appealing or just restarting the litigation entirely, claiming that the new facts make it a new case until enough activist justices die and get replaced. They were thinking ahead. And all of you who think that what the courts say is correct, I was just looking for the original instance of pre-wrong. All of you who think that what the courts say is correct are just pre-wrong. How far back did that go? Like I said, August 17th, 2006. What was I writing about then, by the way? Under the title of, it was a comment in Jones' piece, White House responds to wiretaps ruling. Do you remember what that one was about? White House spokesman Tony Snow said, remember him? The Bush administration's terrorist surveillance program is firmly grounded in law and regularly reviewed to make sure steps are taken to protect civil liberties. We couldn't disagree more with this ruling, and the Justice Department will seek an immediate stay of the opinion and appeal, Snow said in a statement. Now remember, way back then, look who appears in the article, or Jones' piece here, Glenn Greenwald. Greenwald thinks Judge Diggs-Taylor is unlikely to grant the stay, but points out that the administration would just ask the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals for the stay instead. He also notes that right on cue, the right-wing chatterers have jumped on board, vilifying Judge Diggs-Taylor. Gee whiz. What an interesting turn of events that was back in 2006. It's 12 years already we've been doing this. I just thought it was valuable to point out at the end of the day on a Friday. That, of course, meant that we didn't get to some of the various other pieces there, but you know how it is with me. I thought it was very important that I share my thoughts with you, even if they were thoughts from 12 years ago. I found it disturbing, mostly really the passage about insane right-wing trolls. That should get your blood boiling. How do you like the idea of being laughed at by alt-right weirdos and incels and the various other kooks and assorted nuts that they have amassed over on that side saying, ha, you thought you were right the whole time, but we were really right. And it's just cheating. It's just cheating is all it is. And it'll be that. I guess I don't want to send you off with just that in mind because you'll grind your teeth all weekend. Yeah. Anyway, yes, it's, Matthew Rigdon also commenting on this. Yes, torture is cruel and unusual. If you do it all the time, it becomes usual and therefore constitutional. In a way, that's really true. There's a whole theory under which, this has been discussed in the past too, that when blatantly unconstitutional practice makes itself apparent, the other branches are obligated to point this out and to try to do something about it. And there is a legal theory, and I think it was Justice Frankfurter's theory, of this about the opportunity presenting itself and being passed up was by itself meaningful. In other words, not doing anything drastic about opposing torture as a policy was a viable method of acquiescence. In other words, it was clearly the prerogative, if not considered the duty, of the legislative branch and the judicial branch to oppose this expansive view of detainee policy and the endorsement of torture, despite the prohibition against it in the Constitution, and to reject, for their own sake, the unitary executive theory, not to mention the mechanism of using signing statements and claiming that absolved the president of any obligation to follow statutory law. But the failure to register significant protest could, and possibly, he was arguing, should be viewed, Frankfurter said, as what becomes part of the, how did he put it, the gloss of law. And I can't remember exactly how he put it, and maybe I can quickly Google that up. But basically, being presented with the opportunity to establish that these practices were clearly in the wrong and to establish it with, clear and unequivocal action, impeachment, trial and imprisonment, anything, even just passing statutes and then standing up for their validity in the face of signing statements, was basically, the failure to do so. Yes, the historical gloss, the gloss on executive power, as he put it, becomes interpreted as, well, if the people whose job it was to stand up and say it was wrong, people whose job it was at the minimum to stand up for their own prerogatives under the Constitution, even if they agreed with the president and say, okay, we're in agreement, but you can't just sign things away. There's no such thing as obviating law with signing statements. If they opt not to do it, it can and possibly should be viewed as an historical gloss establishing the acceptability and perhaps legality and maybe even constitutionality of such practices. It was an enormous gamble to not look back. And I think we probably lost it and may lose it still. Now, this is not to say that there is nothing that can be done about Kavanaugh. He's on the bubble for sure. And you should absolutely, obviously, be contacting your senators about it. And I guess if you really get a chance to bend their ear, you could tell them this story of historical gloss and where that came from and what it means to not stand in the way of appointing a Supreme Court justice like this one. Don't know how much influence that'll have with Republicans, although I guess there's some indication that there are some Republicans who wouldn't mind necessarily going out with a bang But we're waiting and waiting on those guys to make it obvious. And at this point, you still just have to cross your fingers and hope against hope. Anyway, didn't mean to be that depressing for you on a Friday. But again, you are among friends if you're down in Netroots Nation, New Orleans. And those of us who are not, I guess now it's time for us to tune into the live stream. Well, wait until you hear Justice Putnam's program coming up next. But you can have one eye on the live streams of the conferences and panels going on down there, and one ear on Justice as he brings you these stories and more next. Let's take a look at what he's got. Woo, man. All right, starting off in his Bistro Cafe, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, that liar, refuses to affirm that the press is not the enemy of the people. You heard all about that, of course. And because of violent threats the press have lodged against Trump, ICE, and her personally, you know they really are the enemy of the people. While everyone was obsessed with his Twitter rants, Trump quietly gutted 2 major Obama achievements. A new letter from 24 attorneys general calls on the U.S. to end anonymous shell companies. Ooh, that'd be an interesting idea. And Trump gets smacked down by the ghost of Justice Antonin Scalia. He must not have liked that.
From Daily Kos Radio.
That's what you get for murdering him.
NetworksRadio.com.
Oh, oops. So Mike Live.
You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show.
With David Waldman.
Hey, thanks for listening. And how do you like this story coming up, too? Let's see. In a failing attempt to reassure the public about the 2018 election, John Bolton was forced to quote Putin on what Trump said at their Russia summit. And with apologies to Elon Musk, don't mention his name. It's now clear that colonizing Mars is unlikely and a bad idea. Next.